So actually, I was chairing a session at Eunos Security so who's heard of Eunos Security, by any chance? Okay, it's sort of a US-centric thing. I'm chairing the conference itself this year. We have a record, I think over 1,000 authors have submitted papers this year. We're in the middle of reviewing them now. And we had, I think, about 350 submissions. So it's quite the challenge. But glad to be here, glad to come out. I'm going to talk about medical device security today, and I saw Florian's talk this morning, so it'll be, I think, dovetailing in with some of the themes. I come from the world of academia, so I'm a professor of computer science and engineering out at Michigan, where I direct a center for medical device security. It's an industrial supported center for medical device security. Whenever I give these kinds of talks, I always have a disclosure slide because this is traditionally what we do when anything involving patient care. Generally, you talk about your various funding sources, so you can go read this on your own time. One interesting point maybe I'll raise is the third bullet. There is actually some standardization going on right now in the world of medical device security, mainly driven by the industry and the regulators. The regulators basically bring the industry to the table and so that they start to talk with each other. I'm not going to speak directly about the standards making. It doesn't make for the most exciting talk to talk about standards, but we'll talk about it indirectly. Where you might have heard of some of the research I've been up to dates back, gosh, let's see, I used to work in hospital IT in the early 1990s and the mid 1990s, and we had to roll out a paperless medical record system is what it was called at the time. And so we put computers in every single patient room. We had these little solid-state keys where the physicians and the nurses could authenticate to enter all their data. And of course, everything worked, right? No. So it was quite a challenge to see how introducing not only computing but also security into the medical community was very challenging. And I think, personally, I think it's mainly because of some of the human aspects that we often ignore or downplay as not technical enough. I was part of a big team back in 2008 where we analyzed a defibrillator, so I brought actually one along. If I can trust you to give this back, I'll pass it around. It's been de-dangered, so it's got some epoxy in the shocking ports. And this is, so this, please don't take this. I
will take care of it. I will guard the door.
Okay, all right. But here, if you want to see what a defibrillator is, there you go. It's from a patient who no longer needs it. And then this is an electrode. Actually, what happened is he got a replacement, so he got a new device.
That sounds better.
And this is an example of the electrodes that are woven through a sacrificed blood vessel. A vein, usually it depends on the country. In Germany, I believe they do it a little bit different than in the US, but this is woven through a blood vessel, and then the tip, you can see it looks like a grappling hook. There's a bunch of different styles, but this one's more like a grappling hook. This actually is inside the chamber of the heart, doing both sensing as well as sending shocks, whether it be pacing shocks, which are tiny shocks, or defibrillation shocks, which are much larger. You can pass this around too. Just please make sure it comes back. But this is just one example of a medical device. And I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of different kinds of devices today. But as was mentioned this morning, so the US Food and Drug Administration is sort of driving the conversation right now globally. They're the first regulator I'm aware of who's released draft guidance on what they expect to see from manufacturers when it comes to cybersecurity. To an IT security or to a security specialist, you might dismiss some of what FDA is saying as sort of like pedestrian or elementary, but it's actually huge steps forward compared to what they used to have. And I think the rest of the world is sort of watching to see what happens in the United States when this becomes final guidance in about, I think, 7 months. So what I'm going to talk about today, and the title of my talk is the first 165 or so years of medical device security. The reason why I bring that up is there's a Hungarian doctor who did a study about 165 years ago, and he basically said, you know, physicians ought to wash their hands if they're working in the morgue in the morning and then they go to work with patients later in the afternoon, because if you wash your hands, the patients are less likely to die. He did a control study where he had two different groups of students, those who washed their hands and those who didn't, and the statistics were overwhelming. You know, anyone who saw the statistics, it should be obvious, yes, you should wash your hands. It was met with denial One physician responded, "Doctors are gentlemen, and therefore their hands are always clean." And to this day, we still have trouble with some basic hand washing technique in clinical care, but I'll try to draw some parallels with the world of security. But before I get into sort of the doom and gloom, and actually it's not all doom and gloom, I think there's actually a lot of hope on the horizon, but I want to talk about just some of the benefits. So there are a lot of things out there that you could do mechanically or using purely analog components, but there are certain kinds of therapies where it would just be extremely difficult to do without some kind of computation. So for instance, a left ventricular assist device is a little pump that's implanted in the body, and it's basically a bypass pathway for blood, oxygenated blood. And in recent reports are showing that it has improvements over the earlier purely mechanical model. And there's a lot of work going on in radiation therapy where it'd be difficult to do without computers. Of course, computers also introduce new risks of their own. And you can just go read the Therac 25 report from the early 1990s if you want to know about risks of software and radiation therapy. But what I first want to cover, and we're going to try to cover a lot of ground here, not just security, but also safety, to give you sort of some context of how the safety community thinks about security. Or as I learned this morning, what is it, Sicherheit. Yeah, right, okay. So, anyone here a physician? Okay, all right. Well, you're going to all become sort of pseudo-doctors at the end of this, at least as far as implantables go. So, let me give you a quick history tour of pacemakers and defibrillators. So about 50 years ago, the first pacemaker was implanted. It actually used to be a rather large external device. You needed this nurse, a big burly nurse, to actually cart it around for you, and the batteries external. But then it was made small enough to implant beneath the clavicle. And actually in Germany, I understand that they implant it beneath the muscle for cosmetic reasons, but in the US, it's more typical you do it above the muscle. But here you can see you have what's called a wand. It's using something called inductive coupling, kind of like an RFID tag, and it's setting it to 60 beats per minute. But what was interesting to me was that in around 2003 was when the major medical device manufacturers began to introduce what I would consider forms of wireless communication and networking. It was limited, but it was sort of a milestone in the design of these devices. So here's a picture of an early implantable cardiac device. And this is not wirelessly controllable. There is no kind of RF interface to change it. So how do you think you would change a device if you don't have wireless control? Crack them open? Crack what open? The patient. Yeah. So in the old days, the way you would actually change the settings on an implant is that this is not actually, this little metal is not actually there to hold it up. That's actually how they change the settings. You take a needle, you ask the patient to raise their arm, you plunge it through their armpit, and then you twist a potentiometer. And that allows you to change the rate. So there are actually extremely good clinical reasons to introduce wireless communication because this is an issue of sterility. You are introducing potential infections, and actually infections is the leading cause of complications as well as death for the routine implantation. Of course, you can go all willy-nilly with wireless and things get a little bit crazy. In the US, I don't know if this product is available here, but we have this product called Bakos, and they say just put bacon on everything and it makes everything better. And I've sensed this with wireless communication. Just sprinkle it on every medical device and it's supposed to make it better, but not always. So one of my colleagues out at the Food and Drug Administration actually, he put out a little sort of 101 on wireless security, at least what the regulators look for. And here's a quote: "They look for safe, secure, and reliable wireless medical device systems." And then they talk about what they expect to see from manufacturers when they're putting their device through what's called the 510(k) clearance process. This is a regulatory pathway to get permission to market a device, and every country has something fairly similar. But back to pacemakers. So about 2007 or so, I was just going around calling places trying to get pacemakers, and most people just hung up on me. But I found a sympathetic physician after reading his research papers and his medical journals. And it's kind of cool once you open these things up. On the inside, the vast majority of the volume and weight is just a battery, a very high-end battery, today typically made of silver vanadium oxide. But a very small sliver of that is actually used for pacing or for defibrillation. Most of it is what I would consider like overhead for the microcontroller. What's also interesting is just trends in software in medical devices. So I'm not going to bore you with all the data, but suffice to say, in 2006, there's a sort of magic milestone in the medical community where now most medical devices use computation and software, not just in the design of the device, but in the actual operation. So defibrillators, pacemakers, they all have firmware, and pretty much every device I'm aware of today has some kind of software involved. So that just gives you an idea of sort of the scope here. And to give you an idea of just how software affects recalls, at least in the United States, there were over 537 recalls because of software-related issues. And this affected about 1.5 million different devices on the market. Okay, so before I get to the security part, I want to, again, cover a little bit of ground with safety. But I think you'll immediately be able to see some of the security ramifications. So various countries run databases. This happens to be the US database because I'm more familiar with the US system. This is an infusion pump. And what happens is when a clinician sees a patient injured or killed, they are required to report this. If they just see something go wrong, they don't have to report it, but sometimes they do. Here's the dialog that was submitted by the manufacturer. You can notice I highlighted buffer overflow. So what happened on this pump with the buffer overflow? Well, the patient was underdosed. What happened is this pump, so let me explain what an infusion pump is. This is a little bedside device. You'll typically see a bag of saline and a bag of other drugs, and the computer is what's mixing the cocktail of drugs that's then put through a vein into your body. So in this particular case, when the pump experienced a buffer overflow, its safety fail-safe was to turn off. So when it turned off, the drug stopped going in, but unfortunately this patient needed the drugs to live, so this caused increased intracranial pressure followed by brain death. Like most buffer overflows, this was very difficult to reproduce at service time, but they actually figured out later on that it was a latent bug that was tickled by a software upgrade. So apparently this buffer overflow had been there for years, but just hadn't actually manifested itself until the software update. So that's just an example of sort of the low-hanging fruit that you're going to find inside medical devices today. I want to emphasize too the human element. We have a tendency, so I teach cryptography. I have a background, did my doctoral work in cryptographic file systems, so I love crypto and math, but unfortunately when it comes to medical devices, there are some, I think, arguably as important, perhaps more important issues with human factors. So let me just give you an idea of what is it like to work with medical devices when people do get harmed by the device or people are killed. Forgetting security problems for just a moment, there have been over 500 deaths linked to malfunctions or problems with these infusion pumps, usually having to do with the user interface or the software itself. So my wife claims that I did this, we had a child just to experiment and to get my hands on some medical devices. She wanted to remain anonymous, so that's me, that's our pump, and that's our baby. But you can see the pump in the back. Here's a rack mount infusion pump system. You can see it's got 3 different sort of modules to it. This happens to be one that was recalled a few years ago. I met the guy who had been put in charge of recalling it. He said he had to physically shred the metal when these devices were recalled. But over 700 deaths were linked to these kinds of devices because of incorrect dosage. That is, the nurse entered the wrong data, but don't blame the nurse. You got to think about the user interface too, as well as malfunctions in software. So let me give you an example of the kinds of just really sort of drop-dead horrible user interface issues of recent history. So this is an implantable infusion pump. It goes in typically in the abdomen, and you can see it has this little semi-permeable membrane where you can replenish the drugs, and a little port where it can dose the drugs into the body. And then on the left is the user interface that the healthcare professional uses to type in the kind of drug delivery rates. So can anyone see what is the size of the bolus? How much drug goes into the body and for how long? It's kind of hard to see, so let's zoom in there. So if you can see, there's this thing called bolus duration. and it says, well, we're going to do it for 20 minutes and 12 seconds for a fixed amount of drug. So that pump is then going to act on that command. So this is a picture of the user interface after the recall was issued. So can anyone guess what was wrong in the original user interface that would lead to a potential death? The date? Yeah. So there were only 8 things missing from the earlier user interface. HH:MM:SS. So what happened was this user interface was presented to the healthcare professional in a way that encouraged error making. It was very easy to mix up minutes and hours. So what happened, according to the report in the FDA MAUDE database, is that this patient was discovered to have given a quantum of drug. This is a bolus. This is a finite quantity over 20 minutes instead of 20 hours. So this is a 60 times overdose. And don't forget, this is an implanted pump. The recall was very simple. It said we labeled it. FDA requires the manufacturer to label it. Unfortunately for this patient, he or she passed out while driving because of the pump, and then later died after the family removed life support. So I don't know if you can argue that the user interface directly killed the patient, but it certainly was a key contributing factor to those risks. Oh, and I guess I have one out of order slide, but hey, there you go. I got to put it there since we're not too far from Italy. Let me move forward. Okay. So that's an example of the safety world. So just to put it in context, patients are injured and killed all the time from problems in medical devices. And in the safety world, you think about risk management, and you think about balancing risk, and you think about basically population, so in public health. So they don't usually think about the health of an individual person as much as they do population. So when they're deciding, when a regulator is deciding whether to approve or clear a new device, they have to think, will more people live if we approve it, or will more people live if we don't? And it's not a matter of will people be harmed or not, it's all about relative risk. So you got to keep that in mind, especially when it comes to security, because just because there's a security problem doesn't necessarily mean the risk is going to be different. Perhaps fewer people will be harmed if you don't deploy a security solution, but you need to make an argument for that. So when I think about security, I think the most exciting thing is management. Is anyone here a manager? Okay, okay, good. So I used to collect all these little dialog boxes whenever I'd get a little software update on my computer. Nowadays it just happens. Nobody even tells me, I guess. But this happens on medical devices too. So you might recall a few years ago, there was a little problem with a McAfee software update where the McAfee software, the antivirus program, accidentally misclassified a Critical's Windows DLL as malicious and then quarantined it. After they quarantined this, it basically went into this blue screen of death. It would just constantly lock up and have to reboot every time. Oh. Actually, this is a loaner computer, so let me see here. I actually left my computer at home, so she didn't update her computer recently. Where do I click? Let's see. Just kidding. Okay. Okay. But you know, this actually happens in hospitals. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good night, folks. Try the veal. So this actually happens in hospitals. Some of the problems are, you would be amazed what clinicians have to deal with. I recently saw a picture from a hospital of a Kerberos authentication login system for the electronic health records, where it was so poorly designed from a user interface perspective, the clinicians actually put a piece of tape up on the monitor with a big X through it saying, "Don't click here." Literally, it's a piece of tape. You know the old joke about putting whiteout on the screen? They actually did this because the user interfaces are so bad. But anyhow, in this case, in some hospitals, they stopped admitting patients, except for those with severe issues like gunshot wounds, because just the system wouldn't work. Now, here's another issue, though. Users are kind of helpless. So by user, I mean providers, hospitals, people in hospitals, because at the end of the day, they need to treat patients, and they need to procure systems to treat patients. Doesn't matter if they're safe, doesn't matter if they're secure, they need to treat patients. So imagine if you're told, well, you know, you just invested $250,000 in a PAC system, which we learned was a picture archiving communication system, but it needs to run on an old version of Windows XP. What do? You downgrade, right? So you downgrade to Service Pack 2, but then when you put your security hat on, you're like, oh, wait a minute. Service Pack 2 ended years ago. Microsoft doesn't support it anymore. And moreover, just Windows XP in general goes off support on April 8th of this year. So there are still products in development that are going to be using Windows XP, and yet its software lifecycle is just completely incompatible with what one would expect in clinical care. It brings up all sorts of security and compliance risks. Some of the software is so old that Microsoft doesn't even have dates anymore. It's just amazing the difference in software life cycles used in general IT versus in the medical device community. So FDA used to issue this guidance that I poked fun at quite a bit called shared responsibility. They used to the Food and Drug Administration would tell manufacturers and hospitals, let's please just get along. You know, everybody, let's work together. And so, of course, nothing happened, right? So they would say, keep your systems up to date. You know, manufacturers should update their software, and very few manufacturers or providers were able to do actionable things from this. So recently, FDA has issued much, I think, more specific guidance, mostly for the manufacturing side, because that's what they regulate. And I think it will actually improve security. Not solve, but improve. So, you know, managerial issues, who's covered? I think we all are. But let's get into the security side now that I've seeded you a little bit with sort of the safety stories. Now you can sort of begin to understand, oh, this is why people don't like me when I come to them with security issues. So let's think about the world of sabotage for a moment. So again, back in 2007, 2008, we did this analysis of a defibrillator, and we wanted to know how secure was it because it was using some kind of wireless communication. So I studied this by going into the operating room and seeing a number of patients getting the implantations to just learn the workflow and how things work. And it basically goes through 4 steps. The doctor, actually it's a team of about 5 to 7. It depends. In the US, we actually have a nurse just for billing. So it depends in what country you're in, but you have about a half dozen people, maybe 1 or 2 surgeons. They set certain patient information on the device. Where's the device, by the way? Just a quick check. All right, okay. I'll take that back. I've left this on many podiums, and then I get this email after the conference saying, you're going to be shocked. But so after you set the patient information, the team surgically implants it beneath the clavicle typically, and then test the defibrillation. And then typically, this is what it looks like. You have fluoroscopy going on. This is a form of being able to see actually where the electrode is being woven through the blood vessels. And then typically the patient later receives an at-home monitor. This is like a little base station, and it collects information from the implant and then provides it to the clinicians in the cloud, quote, securely. So at the time, I was really curious about the security and privacy. I couldn't find too much out about it. So I gave a crack team of graduate students a defibrillator and an oscilloscope. They went into their cave for 9 months. And when they came out, they said, look what we got. You got to keep in mind, these were computer scientists who didn't know anything about electrical engineering. So they did all the symbol decoding, demodulation. They discovered there was no encryption at all on this particular defibrillator. So in terms of privacy, you can see basically everything is in the clear. Using the USRP, software-defined radio, they were able to basically decode everything going on between what the physicians use to program a device and the device, basically an entire electronic health record. But privacy, some people care deeply about privacy, some people don't. And I think there are many patients who, if they had to choose between living or giving up some privacy, I think many patients would choose to live if they have to make that choice. But when it comes to security, we were very curious about just, what kind of defensive measures were in place. And so this is widely known now. Here you can see what we did was I took out an antenna from an old pacemaker, connected it to a software radio, and then we recorded literally, this was a really gross hack. We just recorded basically the analog communication and then replayed it. So if you recall, I said that when the implantation happens, it needs the physician's test to make sure that the implant is properly implanted. How do you think the team tests if a defibrillator is properly implanted in a patient? How would you test?
You send a shock?
You send a shock. Okay, I send a shock to your heart, which is in normal sinus rhythm. You're still fine.
You have to induce death?
You have to induce a deadly heart rhythm. So built into every device is a wireless debugging command to induce ventricular fibrillation, which is a deadly heart rhythm. So it's called a command shock. So we recorded this command shock, and then we replayed it. But before we did that, we recorded the command to disable all therapies. And so we disabled all the therapy, basically all the triggering events that would stop the life-saving shock. And then we sent the shock that would induce the ventricular fibrillation. We couldn't find anyone willing to do this for us, so we had to do it in vitro. But it did indeed work, and we measured a large shock coming out of it. Some students at MIT recently recreated this on a more modern band. We did it on the inductive coupling interface, which was in the kilohertz range. The MIT folks did it in the 400 megahertz range, so that's far field. You're talking several meters. I believe that's on the order of like 10 or 14 meters or so what they were able to get.
Kill switch, literally.
Kill switch. Well, but you got to keep in mind though, they are having to balance security and safety. They could have done better, but this is worth a side note. I think, unlike many, so take electronic voting for a moment. From what I can observe about electronic voting, as far as I can tell, the manufacturers and the security researchers really have completely different views of reality. And shall we say, it seems like the electronic voting machines are having a hard time improving. The good news about medical device manufacturing is I think it was just a matter of they didn't understand the security, and now they are beginning to understand it. And certainly all the medical device engineers I encounter really care about getting security and safety right. They're just not sure how to do it. And just like any institution, companies, depends who you talk with. If you talk with a salesperson, they probably won't know what you're talking about. If you talk with an engineer, they're probably going to tell you what they think rather than the company line. And there's a connect that needs to happen. And so what tends to work best is when the security researcher can help the engineers at the front lines to convince upper management to do the right thing. Barnaby Jack, recently deceased, had an interesting analysis of an insulin pump. We did a little WebEx with Barnaby a couple years ago, and he made this user interface. So that's an insulin pump, and he has this user interface that just says dump insulin. I'm not exactly sure how it worked. He didn't tell me exactly what he did, and I've heard different takes from the manufacturer, but suffice to say he was able to cause the device to dispense the entire insulin cartridge, which is a highly undesirable thing. I suppose you could just eat a whole bunch of bags of potato chips, but it's not something you want to tinker with when you're a diabetic. We've also done some work with security of embedded software updates on external defibrillators, and that's just one example because there's tons of external bedside devices. So here's a device you'll typically find in the hallways of corporate offices and in airports. But you can see it says device compromised. And the interesting thing about this particular device related to how to report to people, we couldn't figure out how to contact the company. So fortunately, when we got a software update, they forgot to strip out the symbol table. So we found all the usernames of all the software developers, and we just one by one mailed them. We still haven't heard back. It's been about 3 years. But anyhow, yeah, it's not too hard to find security problems with medical devices, but I think it's important to do so because otherwise it's hard to visualize what could potentially go wrong. But if you want to find malware, just go to a hospital. So here's an architecture of one hospital, and I'm not going to pick on this hospital. This is just a one hospital, and every hospital is basically suffering these kinds of problems. So this fellow gave me a presentation a couple years ago, and he says, well, we've got 664 computers that are legally classified as medical devices. And so I always like to check numbers and add them up to make sure they add up correctly. So I looked at this. It said Windows XP, 600 devices. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. You know, if you add up Windows XP Service Pack 1, 2, 3, I get 16. I think you've got a typo here. And he said, Kevin, no. That's Service Pack 0. They have 600 Service Pack 0 Windows XP machines because the manufacturer and the hospital weren't able to come to an agreement on how to update the software. Sometimes the manufacturer just doesn't provide any software updates. Other times it's operationally not possible. The mean time to infection is 12 days on these kinds of devices when they don't have a traditional IT security product like antivirus. But even when they do have something like antivirus, which has its own risks, it typically doesn't last more than a year before getting infected. So you can imagine the workload put upon the IT security specialist inside a hospital. But how does malware get in? I was surprised to learn. So I talk a lot with physicians, and they tend to send me their war stories. One of the most common war stories I'm picking up is vendors that install malware by accident. There was one story by a woman from the Veterans Administration in the US. So there are 150 or so clinics that serve veterans in the United States. One day she was watching her intrusion detection software and she just saw all these intrusions just pop up. And it corresponded exactly with the vendor who was going around with a USB stick updating the firmware on medical devices. So this third-party contractor was actually the source of the infection in their hospital. I know of one other case where malware got into the product line as they were manufacturing it, but they kind of caught it accidentally. So luckily it didn't get unleashed onto the world. But I wouldn't be surprised if this happens at some point. And then in another case, well, I'll get into it in a moment, but it's just mind-boggling some of the problems they have to go through. And there's a great XKCD cartoon on this if you want to go read it, drawing analogies with electronic voting machines, but I think I'll just go forward here. So I like to download random software on the internet and run it. And I have a colleague of mine, actually a German colleague, Niels Provost, who does this as well as an engineer at Google. And so one day I noticed that there was a recall on a ventilator. And so I tried to download the software. So I went to the product manufacturer's website, went down to the bottom, and I was kind of surprised I could just download it on the internet. It was one of the few times I've seen downloading medical device software on the internet. So I thought, okay, I better archive this so that we can analyze it later. Click, and this popped up as I went to download the ventilator software update. So I think most people in this room probably know what's going on here. If I were speaking to a non-security crowd, you might not. But right, this is the Google Safe Browsing Service. So Niels Provost, with the halo over his head there, good German boy and sword maker. What he does is he goes around the internet, well, his software goes around the internet just downloading random binaries and then runs them inside virtual machines and then sees if the virtual machine gets compromised. If the virtual machine is compromised, then Google flags it as a malicious site. And anytime you click on a link going to one of these sites, Google pops up this little warning if you have that plugin. So for this particular manufacturer, according to the Google Safe Browsing Web Service, they had 38 Trojans and 3 scripting exploits. That brings a lot of confidence. And what I was really wondering is how many hospital biomedical engineers actually just clicked through that link and downloaded. I'm going to guess most of them. Because if I had to do my job, I'd want to make sure that the ventilators were safe, but probably in the process they infected their own machines with who knows what kind of malware. I saw an interesting note in the FDA databases about a software update where a compounder was infected with the virus. So a compounder is a pharmaceutical machine. It's a way to make liquid drugs. So it takes as input, I think, 16 different vials. We have one of these in my laboratory. You input the highly concentrated drugs on the top, and then you have a saline bag as the output, and that's what you give to the patient to create a custom just-in-time drug delivery. So this compounder runs Windows XP embedded. It got infected with the virus, and the response was from the manufacturer, we do not regularly install operating system updates or patches. That's their policy. And this really confused me. And so actually a lot of manufacturers still to this day say that they don't offer patches or software updates, and they usually cite some arcane, non-existent FDA rule. And so FDA has been trying for years to try to dispel this myth. FDA actually expects manufacturers to regularly patch, keep things up to date. And they have, FDA has released this really long, boring document on like, you should keep your software up to date. So I said, you guys, you really need a one-sheet kind of thing to give the manufacturer. So I created one. So here it goes. It says, homework prevents me from passing class. Your favorite dating site prevents me from getting dates, and FDA rules prevent software updates. Bullshit. You know. So there is some truth to this, but the point is FDA and most regulators do expect the manufacturer to keep the software up to date. The hard truth, however, is that there is a real cost to it. So keep in mind that updating a medical device is not as simple as downloading, some new Linux package. There's some pretty sophisticated verification and testing that goes on. It takes a huge amount of engineering time. They need to validate that everything they produce matches their models. They have hazard analysis. They want to make sure that everything matches up as they expected. So it does take a significant amount of engineering time to do. However, the manufacturers do have an obligation to do this. All right, moving on. So this is probably not a question that comes up in this audience, but it's certainly a question that comes up when talking with medical manufacturers. Do we really need to worry about security? Aren't you guys just, a bunch of, a fanatic, perfectionist? You want to have everything secure. There's a little bit of, they have a point. But actually, there are cases, at least in the pharmaceutical world, of people causing harm. So in 1982 in the United States, it's still an unsolved mystery to this day. Somebody deliberately tainted extra-strength Tylenol with cyanide and put this back on the pharmacy shelves. An entire family died when ingesting it, and then later at the funeral, more family members took the drugs and they also died. Overnight, all Tylenol was pulled from shelves in the United States, possibly even here in Germany, I don't know. But that's why we have this sort of tamper-evident metallic foil typically on top of over-the-counter drugs today because of this particular incident. So things tend to be a little bit reactionary. There hasn't been this kind of incident in the medical device security world, and I hope there never will be. But at least I'm trying, and my colleagues are trying to make sure that we never need to worry about that particular thing. But bad people do exist, and we would be unwise, I think, to think that everybody means well. So there was an epilepsy support group website where somebody decided to just post flashing animations to cause seizures. So if you leave the door open, somebody will walk through it. And another common refrain I hear from manufacturers who haven't yet experienced the whole security life cycle is, well, we looked at our statistics and there have been no problems, and so mapping out 10 years from now, there will be no problems. So you can use the Macintosh example. I guess I could use the SSL example now, but oh my God, I can't believe Apple. But overnight, basically, this virus took over 500,000 Macintoshes. So the medical community doesn't yet understand the model of intentional failures. They're used to looking at sort of Gaussian accidental failures, where previous behavior predicts future behavior, and it's hard to describe security in those terms. Computer virus spreads to humans. I suppose it could happen. So in the United States, we have these, again, about 150 medical centers for veterans, and they're actually on the leading edge of understanding the security problems, believe it or not. They've discovered that every 8 seconds, they still find username and passwords in the clear on their hospital networks. I'd be curious how that is in the private sector. But to deal with this whole mess, they have about 600,000 computers, of which about 50,000 are actual medical devices. And the only way they've been able to preserve the security at all is to create just a ton of virtual LANs. So think of it as virtual firewalls. But some of the side effects is their intrusion detection software no longer works on the things they protected. So when they come back and they see that nothing's infected, well, that means nothing on the outside is infected. So they've lost a lot of insight into what's going on, and it's also very prone to human error. There have been instances where a manufacturer just for a split second opens up a port on a device to do a software update, and then configure gets in. Let's move on a little bit. So a little bit of good news, though, and this is, I think, different from typical sort of security researcher goes in to the corporate world. The manufacturers, I think, are actually paying attention to the message. So the president of Diabetes Group in Medtronic was recently actually raised the word security up in par with safety, which in English is actually different. And out at Boston Scientific, also a leading manufacturer of cardiac implants, among other things, they actually think about security in what they call the concept phase. This is radical thinking, okay? So the concept phase means the whiteboard, okay? This is the whiteboard before you've even written the requirements document for what your device does. So this is, good news to hear that security, it's making its way into the beginning, because the old refrain, you can't bolt security on after the fact, you need to build it in. They are actually trying to build it in. Not every manufacturer is doing this, but some of the manufacturers who are a little more clueful are doing so. I did briefly want to talk about a couple approaches to improving security. So I'll talk about just one of them coming out of the research lab. This is a system a couple of my students built over the last few years. It's called What's Up Doc. But what we basically do is we measure power consumption at the power outlet. And from the power consumption patterns, we can tell if your device is infected with malware with extremely high accuracy and precision and recall. So this is our compounder. This is what makes drugs in our laboratory. You can see it's running Windows XP embedded. And it's known to get infected. So when it gets infected, things change. Interrupts fire at different rates. Different things happen. Packets go out. GPUs might kick in. Interesting things happen. And that changes not necessarily how much power is being consumed, but it changes at what rate power is being consumed. So if you look in the frequency domain, if you do a Fourier transform on the power consumption, you'll begin to pick up subtle changes in not just, it's not a signature of malware, but it's a behavior of abnormal things like malware. So we built a device that's basically a power outlet, does some machine learning, and from that you can actually detect the malware. This is an older version of it. The newer version was using a Raspberry Pi, but if you want to learn more about how to actually detect malware without having to change a single line of software, we've got a couple publications up there that you can go look up, mainly from the Eunos Health Tech venue. But the reason why this is, I personally think is interesting, is because in the medical device world, it is challenging to allow third parties to change software on the inside of the device because of the hazard analysis and the regulatory requirements. So the nice thing about this is it's outside, it's sort of the equivalent of your trusted computing base. It's outside your validated space, so it's not considered a medical device. So it's much easier to maintain in traditional IT ways.
Especially from the business aspect of it, because you're right, a lot of people use the validation, qualification, cost, and timelines to delay having to do those type of things.
Right, so I'll repeat it. So as was pointed out, one of the excuses used by manufacturers is the cost to validate, the cost to do all the testing, to do something new. Nice thing here is you can actually, if you discover a new security problem, you can send it out to the power outlet, which doesn't need to go hand in hand with the testing of the device because it's outside the scope. One other thing I'd like to introduce you to, you might already be aware of signal injection attacks, but I'll try to make it a little more real. So, the heart is just a bunch of signals, right? And it happens to have some muscles in it. There's some interesting things you can do when you can control what the sensors think they're seeing on a medical device. This extends to SCADA devices as well. So, what we discovered is that we can create specially crafted electromagnetic interference that you've probably all heard about things like don't walk near a high tension power line with a certain kind of medical device that could interfere. That's accidental interference. If you can create specially crafted interference such that the medical device demodulates it in a chosen way, you can actually command that device what bits it sees on the analog to digital converter. So let me explain how that's done. This is a typical single cycle of the heart rhythm. So it's called the QRS complex. And if you look in the frequency domain, you'll see that most of the signal for your cardiac rhythm is concentrated in 10 to to about 150 hertz or so pretty low frequency. So what does this mean? This means when you have a sensor on a medical device for at least cardiac signals, it needs to let through all the things in the 10 to 100 hertz space. So it's not going to filter out those signals. So if you can create malicious electromagnetic interference in the baseband, it's going to get through all the filters, and it's going to get to the device. So we had a little fun with this with some testing. We do actually have a cadaver in my lab. Actually the state of the art is something called a saline bath, PC69, ANSI 69. It's a standard for, you put enough salt in it and you use a refractometer to make it the same salinity as the human body to basically simulate how RF propagates through the body. But we also use a synthetic cadaver here with our fluoroscopy. What we're trying to do here is understand, can we actually do this to a pacemaker defibrillator to cause it to do something that it shouldn't? Here's a zoom in on what we did. What we have here on the right is called a programmer. This is the device the clinicians use to change the settings on an implanted device. And then we've got some magnet wire over here, just a very simple magnet wire acting as our antenna to inject interference. And inside the saline bath is our implant. Okay? So what we wanted to know was, hey, what heart rate is the monitor seeing? So when we injected this noise, which is effectively noise, you can see it's picking up these what's called ventricular sense and ventricular pacing and signal onsets. So we've been able to trick this particular device into thinking there's a heartbeat when there actually is no heartbeat. And so from this, a pacemaker that's pacing on demand would stop pacing. So you can stop the pacemaker. Now the good news is, as far as we can tell, this attack doesn't actually work in practice, because the moment you get much tissue in front of the device, it attenuates these signals a huge amount. So it'd be very difficult, I think, to do this in vivo. But the device does allow us to send signal through its filter. We did some other experiments with Bluetooth headsets. It's a completely silent room, but we transmit electromagnetic interference that actually we measured the resonant frequency of the piece of wire going between the microphone and the amplifier. And so from that, you can decide what's the best kind of carrier frequency to use to deliver your chosen signal. And we deliver classical music to this particular Bluetooth headset. The room's silent, but then when you're listening, you're hearing this beautiful music. And it's actually higher fidelity than what you can get over the microphone. Because we're able to bypass, the microphone is actually really cheap. So we can bypass the mic and get higher fidelity music. But the point is, all sensors have amplifiers and filters. And it's not too hard to measure the resonant frequency of the physical wire between the sensor and the amplifier. From that, you can create a carrier of the optimum frequency, and then you can modulate onto that the chosen signal you want. And then this whole system on the device acts as an unintentional demodulator and then delivers the signal to the computer. So it looks like we're just about out of time, so I'm going to wrap up. Going back to that original analogy about hand washing 165 years ago, back then again, Semmelweis was basically saying, hey, physicians should wash their hands. Dr. Meigs was saying doctors are gentlemen and therefore their hands are always clean. I think if they were alive today and talking about security, the argument would go like this. Semmelweis would be saying medical devices should be secure, and doctors are gentlemen and therefore their computers are always secure. But let's just examine that for a moment. Why could that be true? The reason why it might be true is, well, actually back in the 1840s, not all hospitals had running water. Latex gloves didn't exist yet. So it was physically difficult for a physician to clean their hands. So you can imagine physicians being told by some other person, go please wash your hands. You're like, oh, well, wash my, yeah, that's easy. I got to go down the street, or I got to use this caustic liquid that really hurts my hands. So you can understand why physicians might be upset at that suggestion. I think the same thing can be true for security today, because there is no silver bullet. So to tell a medical manufacturer or to tell a biomedical engineer or a clinician, hey, you need better security, of course they're going to laugh, because there is no silver bullet they can buy. Whereas in the safety world, there is no silver bullet either, but there are some well-known techniques they can do. It's taken 165 years, but there are some well-known techniques and products they can use to improve safety. So I think in the security community, we need to figure out in the next 165 years how to make this not the silver bullet, but how to make it presentable to someone who wants to get this security property. So of course you want to design it in rather than bolt it on. Actually, this thing got recalled. I had one for my son. It's called a Bumble, but yeah, don't bolt it on. And I'm sure you've all heard about what I call the pixie dust approach to security. You've probably heard these in your travels. You know, these are my favorite oxymorons down here as medical manufacturers are looking to buy silver bullets. Windows XP security is one of my favorites. Private networks. Yeah, just put the word private in front of it and then everything's okay. Proprietary security. I mean, we can laugh about that here, but there are many medical manufacturers who just don't yet understand that proprietary doesn't mean better in terms of security. And if you approach a manufacturer and then laugh at them, they're not going to respond very well. So you need to figure out a way to deliver your message without calling them jerks. Okay. Also, don't forget the economics. So what I like to tell the manufacturers is today, by and large, the kinds of problems that are security problems on devices today are mostly, I think, accidental. Malware getting in by accident as collateral damage. It just happens to be running a commodity operating system, so it's valuable to send spam. And you can pick your favorite study, but you only need to have about 1 person out of 12 million to respond to a piece of spam to make it profitable. And there are actually medical devices that participate in botnets. So if a medical manufacturer can design their medical devices to be less, more, worthless basically to the spammers, I mean, something even as simple as turning off port 25 might actually reduce the economic incentives. So I'm not saying these are silver bullets, but there are ways to actually reduce the incentives for medical devices to be compromised accidentally. If you're talking about targeted malware, that's a whole other thing. So cybersecurity now for medical devices is what we call a foreseeable risk. This is a legal term, meaning manufacturers are expected to deal with it in their hazard analysis. So as a manufacturer is designing a new medical device, they have to basically list all the ways it can possibly fail as part of their hazard analysis. And now cybersecurity is expected to be part of that. So I would argue that although it is important to think about hackers breaking into medical devices, I don't think today that is the most significant problem. It is, I think, going to be a problem in the future, but right now the biggest problem is malware that just accidentally gets in because we're using commodity operating systems that are just vulnerable. Windows XP. I know of an MRI machine in Boston running Windows 95. So there's some really old software out there. And the risks from this are not your traditional risks when it comes to security. The big risks, as far as patient safety goes, as a result of security, are things like wide-scale unavailability of patient care. Imagine you have a hospital and all 1,000 of your infusion pumps suddenly stop working. That would be a wide-scale unavailability. Another significant risk is the integrity of the medical sensors. So if the medical device begins giving incorrect data to the physician may make the wrong decision. Now, in practice, there are checks in place. It's a sort of sanity check. If your pulse were, 1,000 beats per minute, I would hope the physician would say, no, something must be wrong with this device. Although I have a funny story on that. When my son was being born, they had a contraction sensor that had to be implanted, and the nurse and the doctor couldn't figure out how to connect the contraction sensor to the monitoring device because they had 2 different kinds of ports on it, and so they were talking about gender benders as they were doing this as my son was being born. But so integrity of medical sensors, though, is important because if malware breaks into a device, it could start changing the interrupts. And don't forget, if you miss an interrupt, maybe you'll skip that sensor reading and you're going to give bad data to the doctor. These are not your traditional security problems. If you're interested in some more information on this, I have a blog at blog.securemedicine.org. Every now and then I post these kinds of stories as I pick them up from manufacturers. And if you do find a problem in a medical device involving security, there are a lot of different ways you could try to report it. You could try contacting the manufacturer. That's usually hard because they usually aren't set up to receive such data. if you don't mind talking to the United States, I mean, I guess we're listening to you, right? You could use what's called the MedWatch Form 3500. This bureaucratic speak is a document that the FDA uses to collect data on injuries and deaths related to medical devices, but you can also use it for things where you don't know of a death. But wrapping up, if you're thinking about getting into medical device security, I think it's a really great place to work because you can actually help people. And it's also a place where the manufacturers do actually want to get your help, but you need to speak their language and you need to understand their culture. So we actually held a workshop last year where we had about 65 people from medical manufacturers show up out in Michigan, where we all sat down. It was off the record. It was sort of like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and basically every manufacturer got up and said what their problems were, and at the end of the day they all looked around and they said, we have the same damn problems. Let's all solve this. So we actually started solving a lot of the low-hanging fruit at our meeting. So if you're interested in that, you can go look at the Archimedes website. And I'm supposed to embed these tokens in my slides, so for a good time, use this token. But I think I'll end there if we have any time for questions. And I think a break is coming up at this point.
Certainly have time. First, wow, great presentation.
Okay, thanks.